where people were trying to sell the bond market or short the bond market because of the inflation that was building. But that was a widowmaker trade. It wasn't working for 10 years, really 15 years, because the Federal Reserve changed their mandate. They became the activist Fed, and so they became the buyer of first order for all the junk in the system, and they bloated their balance sheet. And this was always so they deferred the day of reckoning. So we've had now, instead of a normal business cycle in America, which would happen every generation, we've now had 2 generations or 2.5 generations without a correction or a recession to purge the malinvestment out of the system. And so that made the system incredibly fragile. And now that we're at that day of reckoning, it's going to be devastating. So the tools that the central bank has at their disposal are very blunt objects, and there's no room for nuance, really. There's only 2 possible outcomes. Either they keep raising rates and crash the entire economy worse than we saw in the Depression of the 1930s, or they're going to reverse course and engage in another round of money printing, and that would imply hyperinflation. Even Jack Dorsey saw the hyperinflation writing on the wall 6 months ago. Michael Saylor eloquently described what's happening as the melting ice cube, right? A lot of smart people have been warning about this for a while. I think that what we can say is that at some point the Fed will choke and they'll go back to massive money printing, and then the inflation will get really nasty. So then that's when you have, that's when you have gas at $10 a gallon. That's when you have food doubling and tripling again in price. That's when you have housing taking another huge leap higher. And so that's going to be the end of the post-war period of what some would call the American Empire. So it lasted from 1940s to 2022, 2023. That was the American Empire. That was the period. The mainstream media was warning about deflation for years, and the mainstream media didn't think all that money printing would have any consequences. And the inflation genie's out of the bottle. They said it was transitory. And all as a chorus, they've been pushing pro-Wall Street propaganda, and we saw all the propaganda pushed on behalf of the mRNA stuff. That's turned out to be massive psyops. And so now you've got the same machinery in place, all in a lockstep, without a single dissenting voice in American mainstream media, pushing the same talking points concerning El Salvador. And well, one phrase in particular stands out from what you just read, and that would be dismantling democracy. So the reason this is patently false and demonstrably false is that the president of El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender, and in so doing gave 7 million Salvadorans the right to unconfiscatable, uncensorable wealth and property. Now, this is decentralization, democracy. Okay, this is the complete opposite of the claim of dismantling this democracy. It reveals that the notion of democracy in the American press is no longer consistent with that as expressed in the Constitution and the founding documents of the U.S. The U.S. The phrase the quote that you're talking about that I said was that Bitcoin is a mirror that exposes people in a way. If you're a bad person, it exposes you to be a worse person. If you're a good person, it tends to show you in even a better light. Michael Saylor was an unknown CEO, and Bitcoin made him into a Bitcoin legend. The founder of the BSV project was already on shaky grounds in terms of mental stability, and Bitcoin turned him into a full-fledged psychopath, right? So that's the power of Bitcoin. It's a force multiplier. So it's revealing the fact that the press in America is sadly in a sad state where the truth is seen as the enemy of the state. And when you're talking about money that separates for the first time money from the state, well, the state's going to not like that. And so all media in America is state-sponsored media. The Rolling Stone is state-sponsored media. CNN, state-sponsored media. There is no independent, non-state-sponsored media, with very, very, very few exceptions. I can think of only maybe one journalist who's flirting with challenging the empire on Fox. But other than that, you just have essentially the deplatforming that goes on. And it's also from El Salvador, you get to see the United States with a bit of perspective. And it's a bit sad to see a once great nation become insecure and fumble so horribly with concepts like freedom. They've completely lost the plot in the US, I'm sorry to say. The IMF loan, as I suggested to the president a few months ago, which he made a public acknowledgement of and is now following up on, is to pay off the IMF debt completely with the volcano bonds that are in the works. I think that the one major misconception about El Salvador's economic position versus the IMF and other creditors is that here in El Salvador, with the economy growing at over 10% a year, tourism exploding, forward investment incoming in the billions, all the other positive things that are going on, El Salvador literally has the ability to pick and choose when they want to do stuff. They'll take care of the IMF when it's convenient for El Salvador. So the IMF can squawk all they want. I know, little inside baseball here, that the IMF is scared shitless about El Salvador making Bitcoin legal tender, and they're constantly, almost every day, trying to weasel their way in and have the language changed on the law. And every single day, the president essentially gives them the finger and tells the IMF to fuck themselves. And then he uses, and many times he uses those exact phrases. So the IMF is a dead institution walking. And El Salvador can pick and choose the day and that they want to. And let me put it this way: the IMF has already died, but it's not yet buried. So, and El Salvador will pick the day to bury the IMF. My recommendation would be, don't try to time things perfectly. You know, a lot of people going back to World War II, they didn't believe what was happening in Germany, and they didn't leave, and they regretted not leaving. A lot of people did leave, some famous people like Einstein and others. I think in the United States, you have to understand that we're going into a third world war. It's a continuation of the second, which is a continuation of the First World War. A lot of the same political forces are once again coming together for a war. And if you're caught in the crosshairs of that, you're going to get killed. So if you want to live, come to the savior, El Salvador. I think there's going to be such a madhouse at the airports because they're going to have plane loads of people coming in, and they won't have the infrastructure to handle it. I mean, I would say don't come to El Salvador, because I don't need the aggravation of having 5 million Americans, trying to rush in get into El Salvador. It's going to be a pain in the ass. So maybe, but since you're a nice guy and I like you, I'll tell you the truth. But if I'm going to talk to Bloomberg or somebody else, I'll say don't come, because I don't want those assholes here. I just want real people here. I want Bitcoiners. I don't want assholes.